The wind blew dry across the wire, carrying dust from the cotton fields and the faint scent of soap from the barracks. The war was over, but the routines persisted. Roll call, inspections, silence. In the women's compound, one sound broke that stillness, the faint crack of glass giving way to heat. The bathroom mirror had fractured again. For weeks, the women had watched the jagged web slowly spread from corner to corner. They patched it together with ration paper, using scraps from Red Cross parcel labels. The glass still reflected faces, but twisted. Noses skewed, eyes distorted, expressions split in two. They continued to use it anyway, because even a warped reflection was better than none. That morning, a guard appeared at the door with his clipboard. Behind him stood a man in dusty boots, a rolled-up shirt, and a leather tool belt more accustomed to horses than hammers. "Maintenance," he said simply. His name was Jack Turner, a former cowboy from Abilene, drafted late, now the camp handyman. The Germans had called him Der Cowboy. The women froze. Some turned away, others covered their hair. Jack didn't seem to notice. He knelt by the mirror and murmured, "Glass got tired of this heat." He removed it from the wall. The sound made them flinch. He worked silently, cleaned the frame, replaced the backing, and installed a new pane. A few women whispered in German, caution and embarrassment in their voices. "He'll leave fingerprints," one said. "Don't look when he's done," warned another. When Jack finished, he hung the new mirror, wiped it clean, and stepped back. The glass caught the morning light, sharp, flawless, almost unbearably honest. "There," he said. "Good as new." No one moved. No one spoke. He waited, shrugged, tipped his hat, and left. The women remained still. The mirror gleamed like an accusation. For the first time in months, they could see themselves clearly. Faces plumped by American rations, cheeks with color, hair clean. But none stepped forward. Helen Volk, a former Red Cross nurse, whispered, "It doesn't look like us." Another replied, "That's because it does." The barracks fell silent again. The mirror captured every breath, every tremor. By evening, a towel had been draped over it. Passing by, Jack noticed and shook his head. Apparently, they didn't like what they saw. The camp settled into dusk. Guards played cards by the gate. The sky above the wire burned red. Inside Barracks 3, a single mirror waited for eyes too frightened to meet themselves. When lights went out, no one uncovered it. They had survived the war, but not the reflection. Before the mirror was fixed, before the towel was hung, the women had already created a world within their silence. They called themselves unsichtbar, invisible. It felt safer. They obeyed orders, smiled when watched, and never met the guards' eyes. Invisibility was dignity. Rumors carried from across the ocean had claimed American soldiers hated them. The Reich's final broadcasts had promised humiliation. The enemy would strip them of honor, force confessions. But no one had done so. Instead, the Americans ran the camp like a clock. Clean, cold, predictable. That terrified them more than cruelty ever could. They expected vengeance and received only indifference. These women were still considered enemies, but distant ones. In gray fatigues and tied-back hair, they appeared harmless. Camp staff joked that they were housebroken Nazis. They assumed the women felt no guilt, that they were proud of their actions. They were not. They were silent. Among themselves, they whispered about what they had seen and ignored. Trains that never returned, unquestioned orders, the smoke that followed. They had been part of a system rewarding obedience, and now obedience kept them alive. So when the cowboy came to fix the mirror, they did not see a man with a wrench. They saw a threat to their invisibility, a stranger who might force them to confront what the war left behind. The Americans assumed the women were unrepentant. The women assumed the Americans were seeking weakness. Both were wrong. The guards were doing their jobs. The women were trying not to remember. When the mirror was replaced, that fragile equilibrium shattered. Reflection was something they had avoided since before the surrender. The cracked glass had shielded them, making every face fractured, every detail softened and forgiven. The new glass offered no mercy. It revealed the truth. They looked alive again, fed, clean, young. They looked like survivors of something they were unsure they deserved to survive. One guard, watching from the doorway, muttered, "They act like that mirror is a firing squad." Another replied, "Maybe it is." That night, as the women covered the mirror with a towel, Helen whispered, "We survived the end of the world. Why would we want to see what came after?" In the morning, Jack noticed the towel again and thought nothing of it. To him, it was just a mirror. To them, it was a surface that turned order into memory. He could not understand their silence. They could not understand his kindness. He fixed things. They hid from what was fixed. Both believed the other lacked something human. The guards thought the women were heartless. The women thought the guards were soulless. Neither realized they feared the same thing, seeing too clearly. The Americans measured war by what could be repaired. The Germans measured it by what could not. When the mirror was restored to perfection, neither side was prepared for what that reflection demanded. Under the thin towel, the glass waited. By fall 1945, Texas was full of ghosts in uniform. The war had ended months before, but its machinery continued, powered by forms, schedules, and silence. Across 46 states, the U.S. held 425,000 German prisoners of war. A small fraction, barely 2,500, were women. Most were not soldiers in the strict sense. They had been nurses, typists, radio operators, bureaucrats in uniform, witnesses with clean hands and stained memories. Camp Hearn was one of the oldest such camps, its rows of barracks symmetrical, towers at each corner, the smell of diesel and cotton dust mingling with the faint sweetness of Red Cross soap. The U.S. Army labeled it a low-risk containment site. To the women inside, it was a waiting room for history's judgment. The female section of the camp had been added hastily. Wooden walls, tin roofs, a mess hall, a laundry shed, a small chapel, and one long bathroom with a cracked mirror above a row of sinks. That was where the lines always formed. Mornings and evenings, faces bowed, eyes averted. Among them was Hela Vogt, 25. Once a German Red Cross nurse, she had joined the service in 1941, believing in duty, not ideology. She had stitched wounds, buried friends, and obeyed orders. When captured by American forces in France, she had expected interrogation. Instead, she was tagged, processed, and sent to Texas with no questions at all. The absence of accusation unsettled her more than guilt ever had. The camp handyman, Corporal Jack Turner, wasn't a soldier anymore, at least not in spirit. He'd been a ranch hand before the war, drafted into a job fixing whatever broke, plumbing, wiring, fences, light fixtures. The Army trusted him with hammers, not secrets. He wore his fatigue shirt open at the neck and a hat when no one was looking. He called the guards city boys and the prisoners folks. His job took him everywhere: men's compound, motor pool, kitchens, and sometimes the women's wing. The first time he walked through their gate, they stared like he'd stepped out of a movie. To them, he was the American myth, a cowboy who didn't belong to this war. To him, they were just another broken thing the Army expected him to maintain. The cracked mirror was one of dozens of repairs. The camp's humidity warped glass, heat, cracked frames, and the women's barracks had the worst plumbing in the district. The guards logged requests for replacement mirror. 24 out of 18, washroom number 3. Turner wrote beside it, "Replace entire piece, frame, split." He didn't think twice, but for Helen, the mirror had become part of her world. Every morning she looked into its distortion, grateful that the crack blurred her reflection. It reminded her that she wasn't whole, that the past was still broken. The mirror made it easier not to see the difference between who she had been and what she had become. When the American came to fix it, the world shifted. Behind the mirror's story was the machinery that made it possible. The U.S. Army Prisoner of War Service Command issued every item by number. Mirror, lavatory, glass, type B12, 1 per 60 inmates. A replacement was routine, paperwork, inventory, regulation. But in war, even routine things grow teeth. For the Americans, replacing the mirror meant order restored. For the women, it meant reflection returned. They lived in a system where decency was standardized. 1,000 calories per day, 8 hours of labor, 2 showers per week. 0 tolerance for abuse. The rules protected them, but they also stripped them of identity. The irony was perfect. Stripped them of identity. The irony was perfect. A nation that had built its identity on obedience was now being forced to live under someone else's version of it. Helen once wrote in her notebook, "The Americans build fences out of kindness. We built ours out of pride. Theirs hold better." When Turner showed up with his glass and tools, he had no idea that the object he was carrying wasn't just a mirror. It was a window into what guilt looks like when no one dares to name it. Every morning at Camp Hearn began with arithmetic. 3,000 calories per prisoner, 42 gallons of water per barrack, 8 hours of work, 2 showers a week. The war had turned morality into logistics, and America had perfected it. Even decency was measured in rations and soap. The camp ledger read like an equation of civilization. 425,000 German PS, 2,500 of them women, spread across 501 camps in 46 states. The female wing at Hearn was one of the smallest. 60 women guarded by 18 men overseen by one sergeant who believed that order was mercy. They were all numbers now, and the numbers worked. Disease rates fell by 90% in 3 months. Escape attempts 0. Malnutrition none. Every prisoner logged, weighed, and filed into a system that cared not out of compassion, but precision. The United States had built a factory of decency. And the guards didn't need anger. They had paperwork, but there was one thing no ledger could account for: memory. The women were gaining weight. Their skin cleared. They laughed quietly during work shifts. The mirror, when it was cracked, hid those changes. It allowed them to see fragments, to remain victims in their own eyes. But now, with the new glass shining sharp as a blade, they could see everything. And everything looked wrong. Their faces didn't look like prisoners. They looked like survivors of a world still burning somewhere else. The softness returning to their cheeks mocked the ruins they'd left behind. Helen noticed first. She washed her face at the sink and looked up, expecting the same distorted face she'd known for months. Instead, she saw herself as she used to look. Clean, fed, almost peaceful. Her breath caught. "It's not right," she whispered. "We shouldn't look this alive." Behind her, another woman muttered, "They feed us better than our soldiers." Another replied, "That's because we've already lost." The mirror began to change the camp's rhythm. Fewer women lingered in the washroom. They stopped combing their hair in front of it. They washed quickly, eyes down. Some covered the glass with towels. Others scratched its edges to dull the shine. The Americans didn't understand. To them, reflection meant normally. To the prisoners, it meant guilt. Jack Turner saw the towel-lone morning and laughed softly. "Guess they don't like seeing pretty." He didn't mean harm. He couldn't know that the towel was a shroud. For the women, the mirror wasn't about vanity. It was about truth. It reminded them that they were still human in a world that no longer wanted them to be. The camp report said hygiene morale was high. The unspoken truth was the opposite. Cleanliness had made them aware of what they'd been part of. They looked healthy, but they couldn't stand the sight of themselves. The Americans kept writing numbers. The Germans kept covering the glass. One side measured progress by what could be fixed. The other measured guilt by what couldn't. One repaired mirror. 60 avoided glances. 0 explanations. That was the math of reflection. It didn't belong in the reports, but it haunted the air inside the barracks. The quiet proof that survival itself can feel like accusation. Not cruelty, but consequence. Not punishment, but precision. Not fear of the guard, but fear of the glass. When a nation rebuilds its conscience, it begins with what it refuses to see. And in that Texas camp, decency had done what cruelty could not. It had forced them to face themselves. Jack Turner arrived with his toolkit slung over his shoulder, the sound of metal on leather marking his steps. The women knew the rhythm now. Every few weeks, something broke and the cowboy came to fix it. He'd never heard anyone, never shouted, never lingered. But his presence changed the air, reminding them that men still existed, that the war hadn't erased the species that gave the orders. That morning, the sergeant pointed to the bathroom again. "That mirror's loose. Check the bolts." Jack nodded and went in. The women froze in mid-task, washing, scrubbing, folding towels. They stopped breathing when he walked through the door. He tipped his hat out of habit, then crouched by the sink. The room smelled of soap and fear. The mirror hung there, spotless, but covered halfway by a towel. Jack peeled it back and stared at his own reflection. He saw a sunburned man, lines at the corner of his eyes, sweat darkening his collar. He wiped the glass and muttered, "Hell, it's cleaner than mine back home." Behind him, Helen whispered in German, "He looks at it like it's nothing." Another answered, "Because it is nothing to him." He felt their eyes on him, but didn't turn. He worked quietly, tightening the bolts, rechecking the frame, humming something low and steady, a cowboy tune, slow as dust. When he finished, he said, without looking up, "There, good as new again." No one moved. No one thanked him. He looked at them, puzzled. "You folks hate mirrors or something?" Helen finally spoke. "We don't need them." Jack frowned. "Everyone needs them. Can't shave without one." The women said nothing. The silence pressed down until even the dripping faucet seemed loud. He shrugged, wiped his hands, and left. When the door closed, Hala stepped forward. Her reflection stared back, calm and merciless. The glass didn't distort, didn't lie. It showed everything she had tried to forget. The clean skin, the neat hair, the absence of fear. She touched her face and whispered, "We look human again, and that's the problem." That night, a few women came back after lights out. The bathroom was dark, except for the moonlight spilling through the slats. They gathered around the mirror as if around a grave. One of them lifted the towel, stared at her reflection, and broke. Her sobs echoed off the walls. "I don't know who this is," she said. Another replied, "It's who we were supposed to be before we followed orders." They stood in silence, each seeing not a face, but a verdict. The next morning, the towel was back over the mirror. When Jack came by later, he noticed it again. "Strange folks," he muttered. He didn't report it. To him, it was harmless. Totham, it was necessary. Days passed, and the mirror stayed hidden. The women moved through their routines, washing, eating, working without ever meeting their reflections. It became superstition. Whoever looked too long at the mirror would dream of the past. Helen dreamed often. She saw the hospital in Metz, the wounded crying for morphine, the officer telling her to save it for the pilots. She saw the bombs falling and the reflection of fire on glass. Every dream ended the same way, with her own face looking back from the cracked mirror. She began to avoid the washroom altogether. One evening, she found Jack fixing a door near the laundry. She stopped, struggling with English. "Why do you fix things that will break again?" she asked. He looked up confused. "Because that's the job." She nodded slowly. "That's what we used to say." Then she walked away. That night, he thought about it while eating supper with the guards. "Those girls don't need fences," he said. "They're locked in their own heads." The sergeant shrugged. "Let him be. They're quiet." But Jack couldn't shake the thought. The mirror he'd fixed had become something else, a thing no one wanted, but no one could destroy. In his logbook, he wrote one line: "Repaired mirror twice, still not used." Repaired mirror twice, still not used. For him it was an oddity. For them it was purgatory made of glass. The mirror did not break again. That was the problem. For months it stayed there on the wall, clear, flawless, cold. The towel remained draped over it. then removed, then replaced, like a flag no one wanted to salute. It became part of the camp's quiet math. 1 mirror, 60 women, 0 reflections. Major Kellogg's weekly report mentioned everything that mattered to the U.S. Army. Rations, labor output, incident logs. Hygiene facilities, functional, he wrote. Morale, stable. The paperwork didn't see the silence. It didn't see what the women avoided. It couldn't measure guilt. Inside the barracks, something started to erode. The longer the women lived, the clearer the mirror became, and the less they could bear to face it. They were eating well. They were safe. They were treated by the book. But every comfort sharpened the contrast with what they remembered. Each new sign of health was its own indictment. Smooth skin meant they hadn't died like the civilians they'd passed on the road. Full stomachs meant they'd been spared when others starved. The mirror didn't lie. It just showed that survival had a price. Helen tried to reason with herself. "It's only glass," she whispered, but she couldn't look at it. She washed her face by feel, turned her back while combing her hair, dressed without checking alignment. The reflection had become unbearable precisely because it showed no visible stain. Her friend Greta said they cleaned us on the outside, so the dirt inside shines brighter. Jack Turner didn't see any of this. To him, the camp ran perfectly. He logged maintenance, fixed light bulbs, patched pipes. When he passed the women's wing, he nodded politely and moved on. Sometimes he caught their eyes, brief, startled, distant, and thought they looked more like patients than prisoners. One afternoon, he found Helen sitting outside the laundry building. She was staring at her hands. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I just don't know whose hands these are." Jack frowned. "Pretty sure they're yours," she smiled faintly. "Not anymore." He didn't understand, and she didn't explain. He tipped his hat and left. That night, she opened her small notebook and wrote, "When I was hungry, I felt human. When I am clean, I feel like a ghost." The next morning, she covered the mirror with a towel again. By December, the guards noticed the women were quieter, slower, less responsive. No riots, no defiance, just the sound of work without voices. One sergeant joked, "They're turning into shadows." But shadows still reflect light. These women had gone past that. The system kept working. 3,000 calories, 8 hours of labor, weekly inspections, everything precise, humane, effective. Yet inside that perfection, the prisoners' spirits sank below the numbers. The more orderly the camp became, the less alive they felt. Helen wrote again, "We are well-fed, well-kept, and unwell." The Americans measured progress in statistics. The Germans measured it in silence. Jack saw it once. Early morning, frost on the window, light catching the mirror's surface. For a second, he saw faces behind him in the glass, blurred, ghost-like, watching him without expression. He turned. The room was empty. He rubbed his eyes, muttering, "Hell of a place." He wrote another line in his log. "Mirror still fine." For the U.S. Army, that meant success. For the women, it meant collapse. They had survived war, hunger, and loss. But they couldn't survive reflection. In the end, nothing broke. Not the glass, not the rules, not the system. Only the people inside it. And when mercy becomes mechanical, even kindness can crush. January 1946, the winter sun was pale and cold over the Texas plains. The frost on the barrack roofs melted slowly, dripping down the wood like sweat. Inside, the air smelled of soap and stale bread. The camp was quiet. Too quiet, one Red Cross inspector noted in her report. The women's section, she wrote, functions perfectly. It also feels dead. That day, a nurse from the Red Cross medical team made her routine visit. She was American, 30 years old, polite but direct. Her clipboard carried questions that could fit on a postage stamp: weight, temperature, appetite, morale. She went down the line of prisoners, asking each one the same thing. "Are you feeling better?" And when she reached Helleville, the German nurse, she paused. "You look healthy now," she said gently. That's good. Hella looked at her hands again the same way she had in the laundry. That's what frightens me, she said quietly. The nurse didn't understand. You should be glad, Helen replied. Healthy people are supposed to feel alive. Then she turned away. The nurse wrote something on her clipboard and moved on. After the inspection, Helen went to the bathroom. The towel had slipped off the mirror overnight, revealing the full sheet of glass. She stood before it, unable to move. Her reflection looked back at her, face fuller, eyes calmer, skin glowing with warmth. It was the same face she'd seen in the hospital at Metz before the bombing, before she'd stopped believing in anything but duty. She remembered washing blood off her hands, the orders to leave civilians outside triage the day she stopped asking names. Now that same face stared back unscarred. That was what she couldn't bear, she whispered. This face does not deserve peace. Behind her, 2 other women came in, froze, and looked at the mirror, too. They said nothing. The silence pressed heavy on all of them. Jack Turner passed the open door a few minutes later and saw them standing there like statues. He hesitated, hat in his hands, then kept walking. He knew the difference between broken things and things you shouldn't touch. Later that week, the Red Cross nurse filed her report. It said, clean facilities, adequate diet, medical conditions, excellent, psychological conditions, uncertain. In the margin, she added, they seem afraid of recovery. The camp's efficiency continued. Work assignments met quota. Inspections passed. Discipline held. But under the surface, the women were unraveling. They had been rebuilt too well. One evening, Helen wrote in her notebook, the Americans fixed the mirror. We cannot fix what we see in it. She tried to explain it to Greta later that night. Howdy, when we looked broken, we still belonged to the world that was burning. Now we look normal, but the world is still in ashes. That is worse. Greta didn't argue. She just nodded and said, then we won't look anymore. The next morning, the towel was pinned tightly over the mirror again, sealed like a wound. For the Americans, that towel meant nothing. For the women, it meant survival. Jack stopped by that day to check a light fixture. He noticed the towel again and laughed softly. Still shy, he muttered. Hela heard him and said, it's not shyness, it's memory. He didn't know what that meant, but for her, it was the truest thing she'd ever said. By February, every woman in Barracks 3 could move through her morning without ever looking up. Their routine had become muscle memory. Soap, water, towel, walk away. They didn't need the mirror anymore. They carried what it showed inside their minds. To the guards, they were model prisoners. To history, they were a study in silence. February 1946, another cold morning. Another convoy of trucks crawling into Camp Hearn. This time, they brought 30 new prisoners, transferred from a camp in Oklahoma, mostly clerks and typists from the collapsing German administrative corps. Among them was Frieda Moeller, 32, a logistics officer who had once worked for a supply unit outside Kassel. Her hands were calloused from typewriter keys. Her mind still ran on inventory and procedure. When she stepped into the women's barrack, she noticed 2 things, the silence and the towel. Why is the mirror covered? She asked in German. No one answered. A woman folding sheets said only, you'll understand soon. The Americans processed her the same way they had processed everyone else. Delousing, medical check, new clothes. She ate her first warm meal in months and almost cried. You treat us like people, she told a guard. He shrugged. It's just the rules. Days passed, and Frieda noticed that something in the camp's efficiency felt familiar. The schedules, the records, the precision. It was the same rhythm she'd lived under in Germany. Only no, it wasn't fear that drove it. It was habit. She realized the Americans had done what her own country couldn't. They'd made order feel safe. One night, she walked into the bathroom and pulled the towel from the mirror. The glass was spotless, so clean it looked like water. She stared at herself for the first time since the surrender. Her reflection was not what she expected. She didn't see the officer who had once signed requisitions for train shipments. She saw a woman who had obeyed every line, every stamp, every order that made war possible. She whispered, "This is the face that made everything run." She remembered the forms, how she'd written numbers that weren't men, but people. How she'd balanced columns without asking where the supplies were going. The mirror didn't forgive. It showed a face untouched by smoke or ash, a civilian face in a soldier's system. Later that night, Frida went to the chapel and asked the American chaplain if confession was allowed for prisoners. He said gently, "If you believe in forgiveness, it's allowed anywhere." She smiled faintly. "I don't. That's why I need it." The next day, she told Helen, "We built a nation that worshipped order. Now we live in a country that uses it kindly. I think that's worse." Helen understood. She said, "They make mercy feel like discipline." By March, Frida had begun helping the Americans as a translator for supply lists. She found the irony unbearable. Back to counting boxes and tracking inventory, this time for her captors. When Jack Turner passed through the office, she told him, "You fix glass. I fix mistakes. We both fail." He smiled, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. A week later, she caught her own reflection again, this time in a bucket of water. The distorted image looked kinder than the real one. She whispered, "That's better." The camp reports showed no issues. Food, supplies, morale, steady. The mirror didn't appear in any document. When Red Cross inspectors visited in late March, Frida stayed out of sight. She didn't want anyone to see her looking away from the glass. The inspector noted, "Discipline admirable. Spirits subdued, but cooperative." Before leaving, the inspector asked Jack, "Any problems with the women's compound?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Just one. They don't use mirrors." The inspector smiled. "Vanity is gone then. That's progress." Jack didn't reply. He knew it wasn't vanity. It was the opposite. It was self-erasure. That night, he walked past the barracks. The light from the bathroom window spilled into the yard. The mirror stood uncovered, catching a strip of moonlight. For a moment, he saw movement inside. Shadows shifting, faces glancing at the glass and quickly turning away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, muttering to himself, "Guess they see something we don't." And he was right. What they saw was not mere reflection. It was revelation. The war had ended. The world had moved on. But in that mirror, time seemed frozen. By April 1946, the Texas wind had warmed, and the fields around Camp Hearn began to bloom. Cotton bolls, wild grasses, and the slow return of color to a land long gray. The war faded from conversation, replaced by plans, crops, and baseball. Only inside the wire did it linger, a fog no sunlight could burn away. The women had grown thinner, not from hunger, but from the weight they carried within. Their health was fine, but their hearts remained heavy. The mirror still hung where Jack had fixed it months ago, gleaming, untouched, unused. To the Americans, the camp was a success story. No disease, no violence, no escapes. Order had triumphed. But order alone cannot heal what it merely contains. One morning, Jack Turner passed the women's compound with a clipboard. He noticed the mirror again, uncovered, catching the light just so. He wondered how strange it was that the only thing in this place that stayed perfect was the one thing nobody wanted. He asked Helen, "Do you ever look at it?" She shook her head. "It shows too much." "Too much what?" "Too much that isn't broken." Jack said nothing. He was never a man for words. He simply nodded and left, writing one final note in his maintenance log. "Mirror secure, condition unchanged." That would be the last entry ever made about the women's barracks. The official history of Camp Hearn would never mention the mirror. It recorded food, inspections, Red Cross visits, and 0 escape attempts. It celebrated the system, but systems do not capture truth. People do, and people forget what hurts. Inside the barracks, the towel stayed off now. Not because the women had embraced their reflections, but because they had learned to look without seeing. They brushed their hair, washed their faces, passed the mirror without pausing. It had become part of the structure, like the walls, the sinks, the silence itself. Helen's last diary entry was one sentence. They gave us glass and called it mercy. When release orders came in June, no one cheered. They packed quietly, folded uniforms, and lined up by the trucks. As they left, Frida glanced back at the building, catching sunlight glancing off the mirror, then turned away. On the ship bound for Germany, she told Hala, "I don't think I can look at another mirror again." Hala replied, "Then don't. Just remember what you saw when you tried." That was their verdict. Not from a court, not from a judge, but from themselves. They had survived, but survival carried its own reflection, one they could not face. Not hate, but habit had sustained them. Not cruelty, but civility had condemned them. Not punishment, but reflection had destroyed them. The war ended with treaties and flags, but at Camp Hearn it ended with a piece of glass, silent, waiting, a mirror that showed no blood, no smoke, no flames, only faces struggling to believe they belonged among the living. When the last transport rolled away, Jack stood outside the empty barracks, peering through the window. The mirror caught his image this time. One man, one reflection, alone in a room built to contain memory. He whispered, "Guess it never needed fixing after all." As the wind lifted through the open door, the towel fluttered once, fell, and stayed on the floor. The mirror was bare again, and the faces it had once reflected were gone, leaving only silence. By June 1946, Camp Hearn was empty. Barracks stood in neat rows under the Texas sun. Doors open, beds stripped bare. The sounds of trucks and orders had vanished. Only the wind and the creak of wood in the heat remained. The war had finally ended here, months after the last shots in Europe. In the women's compound, the mirror still hung above the sinks, clean, intact, a small thing that had survived unbroken. The same glass that once terrified 60 prisoners now reflected nothing but light. Jack Turner returned one last time to close out his work orders. He walked through the barracks, touching the walls he had repaired, the floors he had swept, the fixtures he had tightened. When he reached the bathroom, the sunlight struck the mirror, blinding and perfect. He stared at his own reflection. A little older, a little grayer, eyes tired. He thought of the women who had stood there, afraid to look, and whispered, "Guess I never fixed what mattered." He removed his hat and wiped the dust from the glass with his sleeve. For a moment, it felt as if the mirror was watching him back. Outside, a Red Cross officer waited with a clipboard. "You're clear, Turner. Camp's closed." Jack nodded. This place would forget itself soon enough. The officer smiled. "It's just another file now." But the mirror remained. For years, locals visiting the abandoned camp would wander through the ruins of barracks where grass sprouted through floorboards. Some swore that standing in that bathroom even decades later, you could feel the quiet, as if the air still remembered the weight of what was never spoken. No one ever removed the mirror. No one broke it. It simply hung, waiting. The women had been treated humanely. The Americans had been merciful. But mercy has a cost. In that camp, it was paid in silence. They came as enemies and left as reflections. Fed, clothed, healed, and haunted. The mirror never cracked again because it didn't need to. The fracture had moved inside them. As the years turned the camp to dust, the glass remained the last survivor of a war that was supposed to be over. They feared cruelty and found order. They feared punishment and found pity. But what they feared most was the truth that mercy reveals. Sometimes, the hardest thing to face after war is your own face. What else did America repair after 1946? And what could never be restored? The answer waits still. In the silence of a mirror no one dared look into twice. A mirror no one dared look into twice.